This edition is going to be for games that are completing their funding from September 20th through September 26th. I've got 4 games today that I'm going to be talking about. The first is Everyone Else Thinks This Game Is Awesome. They're going to complete their funding on September 23rd. They went in with a minimum required funding goal of $30,000. They're currently sitting at $202,000, which is just under about 7 times that minimum required funding goal. Now the game plays 3 to 8 players in about 30 to 60 minutes. It's a light game because this is a first-time campaign for the publisher and basically everyone involved. I'm keeping the risk on this one at high. Now essentially what this is a betting and bluffing and trivia game. And the trivia here is actually fairly complex and obtuse. These aren't going to be easy questions. In the campaign they refer to this as nerd trivia. So it's going to be kind of specific obtuse questions that your average trivia player may not know. So while the game itself is light in complexity, the questions are very difficult. However, you're not necessarily being asked to answer the questions. I mean, that's part of the game. But like, let's say Dixit, which is another very, very light game, although that game traffics in visuals and kind of asks you to find the visual that a player is describing through their clues. This game will have players attempting to answer the questions and then sort of betting and bluffing on how well the various players answer their questions. So in order to win the game, you don't necessarily need to know the answers. You just need to know how well the other players around the table will be answering their questions. So rather than trying to figure out the answers to the questions, the real function of the game is to figure out which players are going to be able to answer which questions and how well. If you can figure out that and place your bets accordingly, you don't necessarily need to know these hard to answer questions. Now this game is designed by Matt Fantastic, who previously has designed the games Before There Were Stars, Team 3 Green, and Team 3 Pink. The art here is by Zach Weinersmith. He has not actually worked on a fully published game. The only thing that he has worked on is the Cards Against Humanity Science Pack. And the game is being published by Erasmus Fox Games. This is their first published game and their first Kickstarter, which again is the reason for the high risk associated with the campaign. And just to be clear, I often back games that I would qualify as high risk. I just want people to know that it's a first-time entity that's producing it, and theoretically there's kind of more chances for things to go awry with people that are doing it for the very first time. So I don't want to offend any publishers with that high risk category. I'm just trying to help out consumers know which are the campaigns that are being run by more experienced companies who've done this a lot versus companies that are just getting their feet wet. So I typically don't include print and play pledge levels in these entries that I'm doing here in this video. I only include pledge levels that are physical copies for a consumer. So I'm also not dealing in retailer pledges. Also typically do not include the pledge levels that are very, very high amounts that don't really add anything into the game other than vanity rewards, which are when you have your name added into the game or your picture drawn on a card or something like that. Now there is some of that in this campaign, and I'll mention it briefly at the end of the pledge levels, but I won't be going into those pledge levels individually, which means that there are 2 main pledge levels that you can pledge on this campaign. The first is a $35 pledge. It's called the Adjunct, and essentially that's going to get you the base game. Now for $55, you can pledge at the Assistant Professor level, and that will add on a Sex, Drugs, and Citations expansion. I should mention that the rest of the game is all very clean, so if you want something a little more risque or not safe for work, NSFW, that would be the $55 pledge that adds in those cards. From there are 3 other pledge levels mainly at this point in time. They're for $100, $500, and $1,000. They're called Tenure, Endowment, and Grad Student, and they add in various vanity pledge rewards. The first level will get you a card that is signed by the artist. The second pledge level will add in the ability for you to write your own question into the game and have it be published in the game. And then the third one, that high $1,000 pledge level, will include both of those two other things. Plus you'll be drawn into a card in the game. But again, the main two gameplay pledge levels are going to be the $35 and $55 pledge levels. The one that is the base game and the other one that adds in that Sex, Drugs, and Citations expansion. And finally, Erasmus Fox Games is looking to deliver in July of 2022. Okay, from there we have a pair of games that are both funding on September the 24th. The first is called Mythic Mischief, and this is actually not on Kickstarter, it's on Gamefound, so if you'd like to pledge it, you need to head over to Gamefound. I also should mention probably that all of the Kickstarters that I'm talking about, including the Gamefound one, are listed down below in the description section along with a link. So if something that I'm talking about appeals to you based on what I'm saying, you can just go down there, click on the link, it'll take you over to the campaign. And obviously the link for Mythic Mischief will take you over to Gamefound. So their minimum required funding goal for this game was $50,000. They're currently sitting at $385,000, which is just under 8 times that minimum required funding goal. Now, this is a game for 1 to 4 players. It's supposed to play in 45 to 90 minutes. I'd class the complexity on this one, from what I've seen, at medium light, although it's probably deeper into the medium light complexity, kind of neighboring on medium heavy, but I think from what I've seen, still in the medium light complexity. And I'm going to place the risk at this one in medium high. Now, that's a little bit odd because Ivy Games, who's producing this, have only delivered one Kickstarter, and that was for Moonrakers. They also have another Kickstarter, a second Kickstarter, that is sort of waiting to be delivered. It's called Veiled Fate, and that's kind of suffered the same fate as many other Kickstarters that are ongoing right now, where the delivery process has just been delayed and pushed back by everything that's happening right now with global shipping. So they really only have one delivered game. But the reason I'm putting them at medium high instead of keeping them at high, they're a company that does a lot more than this. And from what I've seen, they have fairly deep pockets. They work across media, doing different sorts of things. They've worked for Bad Robot, which is J.J. Abrams' company. And so board games isn't really their only stream of revenue. I believe from what I've seen that they have pretty deep pockets, and they did a really good job on delivering Moonrakers. So I'm not too worried about them. I think, after a couple more games deliver, they'll probably even be bumped down to the medium-low risk, just because they've done a really good job and they've been very, very reliable with their campaigns so far. Now, Ivy Studios, who's produced this game, like to call this game an abstract strategy game. I don't know if I really agree with that. There is something kind of thematically happening. It's kind of based around students at a fantasy-themed school. There's this character walking around called the Tome Keeper, and with their action points and their various actions, players are going to try to be accumulating this game's version of victory points by doing different things, and at the same time, they're going to be trying to control that Tome Keeper to walk him into opponents' miniatures. That's a bad thing. If you fall victim to the Tome Keeper's clutches, that's a negative. So you're spending your action points trying to get victory points and avoid the Tome Keeper and steer him away from you and into your opponents, and they're trying to do the same thing with you. So it doesn't really seem that abstract strategy to me. It's just bright and colorful, and the theme may not really matter. But there is this kind of feeling there that you're walking around in this sort of fantasy-themed library, maybe think of something from Harry Potter, and trying to avoid this Tome Keeper character. So it does seem to me like there is a little more theme here than I would attribute to a game that I consider to be an abstract strategy game. But make up your mind for yourself. So this game has 3 credited designers: Austin Harrison, Max Anderson, and Zach Dixon. And the team at Ivy Studios is pretty tight, so they've kind of been all together even before they were doing board games. And so I think you'll see that in their games as time goes on. I believe you're going to see pretty much the same crew kind of working on everything. So that means that all 3 of these guys were designers on Moonrakers, and they also worked on Veiled Fate, although that game has yet to deliver. Now, there are 2 credited artists on this game, at least for the illustrations. One is Amin Farah, the other is Hale Kazemi, and for both of these artists, this is their first published game. And then finally, this is being published by Ivy Studios, and again, they put out Moonrakers, and they have Veiled Fate in the pipeline, and that should be delivering very, very soon. So interestingly enough, the pledge levels for this game are sort of also designed around academics. So we're going to be talking about mainly 2 pledge levels again on this campaign. The first is for $59, and it's called Professor, and that will include the base game, the Ghosts expansion, and a game trays system. If you'd like to add more game content, you can pledge at the $95 pledge level. It's called the Headmaster Pledge. That's going to add in 2 more expansions, the Trolls expansion and the Witches expansion. It's also going to add in the Headmaster Box, which is a bigger box than you would normally get with the base game, big enough to fit all of the expansions and all of the extras. And you're also going to get an extra set of library components, which theoretically you're going to need if you want to play the Blitz and Tournament modes of the game. Now from there are a couple other pledge levels, one's for $139, one's for $279. They're called the School Spirit and Back to School pledge levels, and these are levels that just include swag. So you're going to get all of the stuff from that second pledge level, the Headmaster Pledge, and then they're going to throw in more things like hoodies, caps, hats, backpacks, things like that. And those are also items that you can add in the Pledge Manager. You could just pledge the Headmaster Pledge and add on the specific items that you want as add-ons. And Mythic Mischief is looking to deliver in July of 2022. So the second game that's going to be funding on September the 24th, and now we're going back to Kickstarter, is called The Spill. The Spill had a minimum required funding goal of $15,000. They're currently sitting at $54,000, which is about 3.5 times their minimum required funding goal. Now, this is a game for 1 to 4 players, so yes, it plays solo. It plays in about 50 to 60 minutes. It looks like it's a medium-light complexity game to me, and I'd put the risk level associated with this one also at medium-high. Now, this is sort of an environmental-themed game about an oil spill. You're going to be using sort of dice and dice placement to hopefully clean up the spill. So it's also a cooperative game, and it relies on action points. I've also seen the team behind it call it a reverse tower defense game, because you're trying to keep something in instead of keeping things out like you would in most tower defense games, where you're trying to prevent some kind of army from sort of invading your territory. Which reminds me of another game that was on Kickstarter within the last year or 2 called Fire Tower. And in that game, you were trying to sort of keep a fire from spreading instead of an oil spill, but similar kind of overall idea and some mechanics. Now, this game is designed by Andy Kim. This is going to be Andy Kim's first big published game. But the artist on this has done a lot. The artist is Kwanchai Maria, one of the best board game artists working these days, in my personal opinion. He has worked on, among others, such games as Cryptid, Dinosaur Island, In the Hall of the Mountain King, the new version of Sidereal Confluence, that's the 2017 version, and Under Falling Skies. And then the publisher on this is Smirk and Dagger Games. They haven't really published anything huge. I'm not very familiar with their games, and they're not very high on Board Game Geek. So they've produced a few games, but none of them have been sort of hugely popular. And their 3 highest rated games are Cutthroat Caverns, Dead Last, and Nevermore. Now, there's not a lot of extras on this one, so there are 2 pledge levels for this one, but there are only 2 pledge levels. There's not pledge levels with swag or pledge levels that you can get yourself drawn into the game like with the other 2 games that we've talked about previously. So for $45, the pledge level called Friends of the Ocean, you're going to get the game, essentially the base game. If you want to deluxify it a little bit, you want to pledge the $60 pledge level. That is called Marine Life Hero, and what that will add into the game are custom wooden tokens that will replace the cardboard ones in the regular base game. And that's it. Those are your only 2 pledge levels. collectibles. There is a $20 playmat that you can add in through the add-ons if you would like a playmat in addition to the board, but it's not in any pledge levels. It's an add-on, and it is the only add-on. And the spill is going to be delivered, hopefully, in April of 2022. Finally, the last game that I'm going to talk about today that is currently running and will fund between September 20th and the 26th is a game called Unsurmountable. Now, this is a very small 17-card card game from Button Shy Games. That's kind of their whole thing. It's going to fund on September the 25th. Their minimum required funding goal on this was for $2,000 because it's a 17-card card game. And Jason Tagmeyer, who runs Button Shy, does a lot of these campaigns for these very small kind of wallet card games, and he ships them out of sort of his own place in Brooklyn. I think they may have an office now as well. But it's done very kind of in a bespoke way and with a very small footprint. So that's how they can have such a small minimum required funding goal and still produce the game at that level. However, they're currently sitting at $73,000, so they've done very, very well, and that represents a number that is 36 times that minimum required funding goal. So Button Shy has continued to do very, very well for what they do. Now, this is a one-player game only. It's a solo game. It plays in about 15 minutes. The complexity on this one I would put at light, and the risk I'd put on this campaign at medium-low. The reason it's not lower, just completely low, is because Button Shy is still a small operation that sort of relies on a couple of people, which means that if something were to happen to one or two of those people, like Jason Tagmeyer, the whole pile of dominoes could fall down. But other than that, Jason has done a lot of campaigns. He's very experienced at this. He's done a great job delivering these. So you shouldn't think of there being too much risk associated with this campaign. It's also a card game, and a small card game at that. So worst case scenario, if you were to lose the money that you pledged on this, likely it wouldn't be very much as compared to some other bigger miniature games where you could be pledging hundreds of dollars. Okay, so the designer on this is Scott Almes. You may know him from Heroes of Land, Air, and Sea, Tiny Epic Galaxies, and Tiny Epic Quest, and for that matter, all of the Tiny Epic games. And the artist on this is Christy Johnson, and this is going to be her first published game. Finally, it's published by Button Shy. I mentioned they do these small wallet card games. Their biggest hits are Circle the Wagons, Sprawlopolis, and Tussie Mussie. Now we're going to talk about 4 different pledge levels on this one. So the first one is for $10. It's called Unsurmountable. It's just the base game, the 17-card game. If you want to throw in this tiny little micro expansion, it's called Dual Peaks, then you're going to pledge $11 instead of $10. The gameplay on this is basically a player puts out 5 cards that represents the bottom of a mountain, and then each turn they can either place a card sort of in the next row of the mountain, and they're trying to get to a peak, or they can remove a card to do the player action that is on that card. So very simple gameplay. You're just building a tableau, and your decisions are whether to add cards or remove cards to use their powers. So if you get that Dual Peaks mini expansion, then in that game you'll just be building a peak with 2 peaks instead of 1. It makes the game a little bit bigger and potentially slightly more complex. There's also a $30 pledge level called New Simply Solo Fan. That's going to give you Unsurmountable, Dual Peaks, and then another little mini expansion called Big Climb, along with 2 base games for other Button Shy games. Those games are Food Chain Island and Ugly Griffin Inn, and those are the other 2 games from Button Shy that are designed by Scott Almes. So that essentially would give you all of Unsurmountable and then the base games for the 2 other Scott Almes designed Button Shy games. Lastly, you can also pledge at the $50 pledge level. That is called the New Simply Solo Mega Fan. That will give you everything from the previous pledge level, and it will add in 4 mini expansions for each of those other 2 games. So 4 mini expansions for Ugly Griffin Inn and 4 mini expansions for Food Chain Island. And Button Shy, which typically runs sort of quicker campaigns with a quicker delivery because they're doing these smaller wallet-sized card games, is looking to deliver Unsurmountable in December of 2021, so just a few months away. And that concludes the currently running Kickstarters for this week's edition of the Kickstarter Weekly. I do have a few more games to quickly talk to you about. do have one game that I pledged from the last video. There was only one game in the last video, so it should be evident what game that is, and that is Wild Serengeti. So Wild Serengeti appealed to me because it is a lighter game. I don't necessarily have a lot of lighter games. I tend to veer more towards kind of storytelling games and really heavy Euros. That's kind of my sweet spot. So when I do get lighter games, I'm kind of picky about them. And I like the fact that in Wild Serengeti, players are basically documentary filmmakers, and they're trying to use player actions to corral animals into different kind of scenic vistas, different places on the board, whether that's through moving them onto the board or moving them around the board. And once they get them in the right place for one of their contract cards, they essentially shoot a scene of this documentary that they're working on. And so over the course of the game, whatever player shoots the highest scoring, which thematically should be the best and most interesting documentary scenes, will produce the best documentary and win the game. And I like the idea of it. I like their sort of environmental angle, but it doesn't really feel to me like they're necessarily pushing an agenda. It just feels like a very fun game with all of these really brightly colorful animal meeples that you're moving around the board. And I know it's something that my fiance is going to really like, and I think it could be sort of a different kind of unique game in our collection. And as I said, I don't have too many super light games, and I'm always looking for sort of compelling, good games to round out my medium light collection and just do different things and be worthy of a game that I bring out to the table to maybe show newer gamers or non-gamers. And I think this game looks pretty cool and has a lot of table presence to it. And it's definitely a game I would use to sort of show off the hobby to newer gamers and present them with something that looks really, really cool that doesn't play too difficultly. And it didn't have that high of a price tag on it either. So that was the one game that I personally pledged this period. I did also acquire one game. It was a Kickstarter that rolled in. That is Rurik, Dawn of Kiev, along with the new expansion, Stone and Blade, also a playmat, a couple little cosmetic extras. So I missed Rurik, Dawn of Kiev the first time around. I think there were a lot of other games at the time that I wanted more, and I don't think it was that cheap, so it was something that I passed by. And then after it delivered, people got to playing it. It got some pretty good reviews, and sort of the heat has been building on it. The designer of Rurik, Stan Kordonsky, is also a designer who is quickly climbing the ranks of some of the best designers out there. So this was something I just kind of wanted to pick up during the expansion campaign and get my little fingers into it and give it a play. And I'm looking forward to doing that hopefully soonish. But that is the one game that arrived and I acquired into my collection this period. Finally, I have two played games. The first is Embarcadero, which I've already done some videos on. I have a Game of the Month video that features Embarcadero as the overall Game of the Month. That was for July, so that was just recently published. I'm also currently working on a first impressions video for Embarcadero, which should be published this week. So if you'd like more content from me featuring Embarcadero and you'd like to hear more about the game, keep your eyes peeled for that first impressions video. But in general, I'll just say I really, really like Embarcadero. Right now, it's currently my number 5 game of 2021. That's behind Sleeping Gods, Kanban EV, Dice Throne Adventures, and Excavation Earth. And Embarcadero is sort of an economic game, also a territory building game, except that the territories that you're building are going to be on wharves in the San Francisco Bay. So you're bringing in ships with resources. Sometimes you're scuttling and sinking those ships for even more resources. And then you're sort of building up buildings on the wharf. This is a game that uses multi-use cards. Sometimes you're using those cards to bring the ships in. Sometimes you're using them to build buildings. Sometimes you're scuttling them for the resources. But there's a really nice decision process in terms of how are you going to use your cards. And also every turn you will be selecting a new card that you'll buy. And then you'll have to make a decision which of the cards in your hand you're going to put aside for the next round. And that, again, is a really cool decision-making process. So you can be putting aside the cards that you just acquired, or you can be using those and then taking some of the cards that you already had in your hand and sort of resetting them aside for the next round. There's some area majority going on in terms of the structures that players are building directly adjacent to the wharves. There's also a council track. There's variable player powers. If you play with the advanced side of the player character cards, which I absolutely would recommend. And I just think it has a very, very good balance of mechanics. It also has really, really good choices, sort of good chunky choices. So it can feel like a heavier game just because of the sort of decision making that's involved. It certainly will satisfy heavier gamers, I think. But it does play more like a medium light game. It's not super difficult to teach, and it's not that difficult to pick up and play, especially if you have someone at your table that has played the game before. So I really like the fact that it is a sort of lighter game that uses really chunky decision making in it. And I think if you're looking for a game to kind of help sort of medium lighter gamers take a next step, this would be a really, really good game for that. It also doesn't take up too much room on the table. The components are really nicely produced. Really nicely. I like the kind of dual layered tiles that they have. There's sort of bumps on them that allow you to place the structures on them. And I like the plastic pieces in the game as well. It just feels very, very well made to me, component-wise and quality-wise. And overall, it's just such a good production. So it's a game that I certainly would recommend, and I'll be talking more about it in my first impressions video soon to come. The other game that I played was called Scoville, and the interesting thing, there is a designer named Ed Marriott. Ed Marriott designed Scoville, I believe, by himself, and then he also was one of the two designers on Embarcadero. So we kind of had a Ed Marriott weekend, and those are also sort of the biggest two games that Ed Marriott has published. I think he may have one or two other games, but they're comparatively much smaller and not that well known. So these are his two big games. Scoville, I'm a little less impressed with compared to Embarcadero, but it's still a pretty good game. It's a farming game where you are farming hot peppers. And there's, again, good decision-making processes in terms of where you plant peppers, how you plant peppers, and sort of how you do that to create other better peppers. So you're going to be sort of making strategic choices and tactical choices in how you place these peppers each turn into a field. And then you'll be walking around your worker and you'll be collecting peppers that are combinations of peppers that you're passing by. So anytime you kind of walk on a pathway between two peppers, you will get a pepper that is a combination of those two peppers. There's pretty good decision making in Scoville as well. A lot of it to some degree is kind of fulfilling contracts and set collection, but I like the theming of the game, I like the hot peppers, and I like the almost kind of abstract strategy mini game that's happening in the main board where you're planting peppers and then walking around and accumulating more peppers. So I like Scoville a lot. I probably won't be doing a video on it anytime soon since it's a bit of an older game. But if it's something that you'd like to see me do a full teach and review on, maybe in a couple months, once I get caught up with all of my first impressions videos, just let me know in the comments and I'll sort of add that to my eventual full teach and review queue. Lastly, let's quickly talk about what's coming for the channel. Now, if you are kind of regularly watching my videos, you know that my hair got really crazily long. In fact, I have a video that I'm editing right now for Shasen, and I think it's likely that I'll get this video edited and published first, just because it's already a day late, and by the time it gets published, it's going to be 2 to 3 days late. Luckily, all of the games that I'm talking about are finishing their funding later in the week, so there'll still be plenty of time when people watch this video to decide if they want to pledge something. So it's not going to be published after any of the games that I've talked about have completed their funding. But in order to make that happen, I think I need to delay the Shasen video and kind of bump this one up in the editing queue, which means that you'll see this new haircut first, and then you'll see my Shasen video with my ridiculously long curly hair. So I had a lot going on this week, kind of personally. I also had some really, really bad headaches that I think were coming from barometric pressure and sort of the changing of weather. And then I had long, crazy hair, which I thought wouldn't look very good in my videos. So a lot of this week was spent doing kind of behind the scenes work, and I have a lot of videos ready to go. Which means that this coming week, you should see me complete a lot of the videos that I've been talking about for the last week or so. I should get them finished shooting and editing and published. That will include, obviously, this video first, then first impressions videos for Shasen, Embarcadero, and Kemet Blood and Sand. At that point, you'll probably see my games of the month for August 2021. And then you'll probably see next week's Kickstarter Weekly, which is looking like it's going to be a very big, long video. There was a lot of stuff that published a few weeks ago that's going to be completing funding next week. And so that video is probably going to be somewhat of a behemoth. And then sort of the week following that, you will most likely see first impressions videos for Coffee Roasters and Grand Austria Hotel, and then full teacher review videos for Chronicles of Crime 1400 and 1900. 1900 may get pushed even further. I'm still trying to get that game completed, playing it with my fiance, but I think right now I kind of need to prioritize getting all these other videos shot and edited before we start playing more Chronicles of Crime 1900. But that is in general sort of the production slate for the next week to 2 weeks. So if you haven't liked this video or subscribed to the channel yet, please consider doing it now, especially if you've enjoyed this video. And be looking for all of those videos that I just talked about. They should all be appearing in the channel in the next week to 2 weeks. So thank you very much for watching. Have a great week. Play as many great games as you can, and I will see you again very, very soon.